All right. Hello, we are presenting on the book Courageous Conversations About Race by Glenn E. Singleton. I'm Michael Knox. We have Carmelita Arellano and Patricia Brody. Real quick before we get started, we just kind of want to provide an overview of the presentation. We're going to first present the various elements of the Courageous Conversation strategy before going into more detail about each of those components. It's also important to note that simply reading this book will not equip you to converse about race. It's going to take a lot of action on your part, a lot of thinking, a lot of processing, and many, many attempts, and it's going to be ongoing. We want to acknowledge and uplift that you must commit the remainder of your life to the actions laid out in this book in order to truly come to a deeper understanding of race and how race impacts you and all others every day of their lives, and truly reap the benefits of interracial dialogue about race and racism.
So we start with the elements of courageous conversation. And the first part are the 3 critical factors. And then there's also the 4 agreements. There are 6 conditions and the courageous conversation compass. And the last one is persistence. Courageous conversation is a strategy and protocol for addressing the various impacts of race on student achievement. We'll unpack these elements of courageous conversation as we look more closely at the protocol. So we'll start first with the 3 critical factors. Through Glenn Singleton's fieldwork and research, he's defined these critical factors necessary for school systems to really eliminate the racial achievement gap. And you must have all 3 in place: a passion, kind of the 3 Ps, a passion, a practice, and a persistence. And when we talk about, we'll move on to each one of them. The 3 critical factors, and the first one would be passion, and it's defined as the level of connectedness educators bring to racial equity work in your district, school, classroom, and equity transformation. So his point is that the passion has to be strong enough because there are so many obstacles. So you have to have a strong passion to overwhelm institutional inertia, resistance to change, resilience to maintaining the status quo. And that's a big one, is that there's often a lot of resilience. But passion is insufficient if it's not translated into transformable beliefs about one's own intraracial and interracial relationships and practices. So it's just, we start with ourselves first. And with practice, it refers to the essential individual and institutional actions taken to effectively educate every student to his or her full potential, right? Because that's the goal with getting rid of the academic gap that we see. So having knowledge, substantial knowledge exists in the form of research-based practices about what works in the classroom for students of color and Indigenous students. So what we need to do is to develop and engage this knowledge, because we don't want it to be perceived as a teaching gap. And that's what could happen, is if you're not at your best with your teaching and your knowledge of the academics that you're trying to put out to them, instead of being perceived as it could get hidden that it's more of a teaching gap. So we don't want that to happen. And then there's the 3 critical factors. Persistence involves time and energy. Persistence calls for each of us to exercise a rare and seemingly oxymoronic combination of patience and urgency. And we just, we don't really put enough time into that when we are addressing the racial achievement gap. Those who persist remain focused on equity and eliminating the racial achievement gap regardless of which direction the educational reform wind is blowing. So it's just staying the course. And sometimes it could be very slow going and a lot of work for very little results, but you stay the course and you stay persistent. So the three critical factors provide a philosophical context with which we will introduce in Courageous Conversations, a strategy, a protocol for addressing the various impacts of race on student achievement, how to engage the Courageous Conversation strategy. And we always want to have these three factors present because this will keep from having a breakdown in the dialogue and a breakdown of the conversation. So defining courageous conversation.
What is courageous conversation? Courageous conversations utilize the agreements, conditions, and compass to engage, sustain, and deepen interracial dialogue about race in order to examine schooling and improve student achievement. So specifically, this courageous conversation engages those who won't talk, sustains the conversation when it gets uncomfortable or diverted, and deepens the conversation to the point where authentic understanding and meaningful actions occur. Okay, the strategy moves on beyond a basic awareness of these racial patterns found in student achievement data to more active, purposeful, and precise process that involves effectively inquiring about why the racial gaps exist, what is the origin of racial gaps, and what factors have allowed these gaps to persist for so many years. So having courageous conversations serves as a strategy for deinstitutionalizing racism and improving student achievement. The ability to truly listen to and converse with each other will help educators improve education for all children and to better understand the racial experiences that impact their learning. So saying that we don't know how allows educators to claim that they have done all that they can do, and such suggestions do not improve results. So why really engage in these conversations? When educators make dramatic progress toward narrowing the gaps among students of different races, they also succeed at closing all related gaps. For example, gaps among students of different economic groups and with differing native languages. Race is an essential and foundational issue that must remain in the spotlight. So in order to be able to address a racial achievement gap effectively, you must first establish common language and understanding around race. So if you are able to look at all areas in a person's life, social, economic, language fluency, academic performance, graduation race, everything actually is affected by how people perceive race and racism. So that's why the courageous conversations need to be existing in school settings. There are 4 agreements of courageous conversations, and recognizing that these agreements exist as a foundation for the conversation enables those who would normally feel unsafe in such a conversation to feel safer, even while experiencing discomfort. Specifically, the agreements offer a safer space so that educators can engage their fears. The agreement serves as a conduit for more meaningful interracial dialogue. These are the 6 conditions of courageous conversations. And these conversations, or these conditions guide participants through the subject matter that they are supposed to talk about and remind them what topics they need to be mindful of during the interracial dialogue. So let's examine each of these conditions. The first and second conditions serve to engage us in a conversation about race. They engage us in considering our own personal racial experiences, beliefs, and perspectives. The third and fourth conditions sustain the conversation and help to keep it moving once we have established a willingness to engage through mindful inquiry into those multiple perspectives, beliefs, and experiences that are different from our own. And the fifth and sixth conditions deepen the interracial dialogue about race by guiding us into the most difficult and least examined subject matters related to how we live and understand race. In this advanced aspect of conversation, we develop our understanding of whiteness and challenge our beliefs about our own association with and relationship to racial privilege and power. So the courageous conversation compass is used in the fourth condition to determine the place of engagement at which each participant in the dialogue is processing the content. And collectively, it leads us to a mutual understanding of our varied beliefs and opinions and helps us locate the sources of our emotions and actions or lack thereof. In a sense, emotional responses are seated in the heart, intellectual responses in the mind, moral responses in the soul, and relational responses in the hands and feet. This compass, together with the 6 conditions and 4 agreements, fulfills the complete definition of courageous conversation.
So what we want to do when we have these conversations is we want to have establish a common language around race. And so they've taken these key terms and kind of defined them so that the conversation is meaningful. So race is socially constructed meaning attached to a variety of physical attributes. And then racism is the belief and enactment of beliefs that one sets of characteristics to superior as being superior to another. Racist is any person who subscribes to these beliefs and perpetuates them intentionally and even unconsciously. So when we view race, racism, and race through the context of historical and contemporary American culture, more broadly, through a prism of Western culture, we can introduce a far more exact definition of racism. Consciousness or unconsciousness, intentional or unintentional enactment of racial power, grounded in the racial prejudice by an individual or a group against another individual or group, perceived to have lower racial status. So establishing common language around race, we have institutionalized racism. And that's the power to create an environment where the belief is manifested into subtle or direct subjugation of the subordinate ethnic groups through a society's institution. So institutionalized racism fosters feelings of inferiorities for students of color in the following ways. They incorporate into institutionalized policies or practices of attitudes or values that work to the disadvantage of students of color. The unquestioned acceptance by the institution of white middle-class values, and schools being passive in the face of prejudice behavior that interferes with student learning or well-being. So educational equity, what exactly is that? It's raising the achievement of all students while narrowing the gaps between the highest and lowest performing students and eliminating the racial predictability and disproportionality of which student groups occupy the highest and lowest achievement categories. Race and experiences based on race are not equal. Equity, however, recognizes that the playing field is unequal and attempts to address the inequality. It assures that all students will have the opportunity and support necessary to succeed. Equity means that the students of greatest need receives the greatest level of support to guarantee academic success. So it has a different definition than equal. Instead of everybody being assured that they get the same amount of something, it's looking at each individual student and realizing that this student has a particular need that maybe this student doesn't have. And so making sure that that particular need is met to bring them to an equal setting with all the other students. Leadership for racial equity is anti-racism can be defined in a conscious and deliberate effort to challenge the impact and perpetuation of institutional white racial power, presence, and privilege. So to be anti-racist is to be active. Anti-racist schools are healing communities where it's possible for students of color to talk about how they experience unfairness and discrimination in order to heal. And they can just feel free to talk about those things openly. To give all children the fair and equitable education they deserve, schools need to analyze how it is that they are serving or not serving their students of color. It's critical that schools address issues around race to uncover whatever institutionalized biases exist that prevent the students of color from reaching their full potentials. So in doing this, you could start like at a staff meeting to implement an exercise. And it would be to have discussions. And before the discussion, you would have every participant define, pass out paper or have a journal and have everyone define the following terms. Define what they think racism is. What do they think institutionalized racism is and anti-racism? And what is their definition of equity? So you would ask for volunteers to share to share with the entire group their different definitions and then kind of compare and talk about them. You would present the definitions for each term based on what is presented in the chapter. And then after the discussion, have each person write down a few new definitions of what each term means. You would divide all the participants then into small groups of 3 or 4 and have little group discussions about how their understanding of what these terms are has changed from what they first wrote to after reading and having some discussion what it is to them now. Then you bring the large group back together and allow people to share any of their conclusions or follow-ups. And then you would have a reflection piece where participants can reflect on their personal learning and keep the worksheets in their journals for later reflection or later to reference.
So we're going to move on to what is the foundation of racial equity leadership, which is the 6 conditions. And we're going to go into more detail about each of these conditions. As Carmelita and Patricia laid out, our main 3 factors, coming to a common understanding of language around racial terms, etc. Once all of those factors are in place, they will play out at different points of each of these conditions. So the first condition is where we get personal right here and right now. We have some questions for thought here. How conscious and aware of race were you prior to opening this book? What can you recall about the events and conversations related to race relations, and/or racism that may have impacted your current perspective or experience? And to what degree and in what ways does race impact your own personal life? These are types of questions you will have participants engage in during the first condition. So when eliminating racial achievement disparities, it begins with an examination of the self rather than the others. And the first condition requires that you must establish a racial context that is personal, local, and immediate. When the conversation focuses initially on the educator's own racial consciousness, identity, and experiences, they can better understand the way in which they may be interpreting their students' academic interest and engagement. Now, this question here, determine the percentage of your life from 0 to 100%. When conducting an activity around this, you're going to get percentage points all over the place. The reality is, though, that race is impacting each one of us 100% of the time. The total impact of race occurs whether you are conscious or unconscious of the impact, and whether you spend time with people of the same race or of a race different than your own. Because people are defined by their racial identity in this society, race is constantly present and having an impact on your experience and perspective. We cannot talk about race collectively as a nation, family, or education system until we have individually talked about race in our own lives, personally, locally, and immediately. Apologies for my daughter crying in the background. As shown here, if you consider your racial consciousness as a fraction, the denominator of 100 signifies the total impact of race and the acknowledgement that race permeates everything in modern American society, as well as in many other societies around the world. The numerator represents the degree to which you are racially conscious personally, locally, and immediately. The difference between the numerator and the denominator is racial unconsciousness. This unconsciousness causes the greatest discomfort in interracial interaction. Using this equation could change over time the more you engage with a courageous conversation strategy. You may begin in a place of I don't know and I don't know. Ultimately, through time and many, many conversations, much listening, much introspection, and whatnot, you'll eventually get to a place where you know much more. This is an implementation exercise for the first condition. It requires individual and group settings, and the aim is to have individuals explore their own racial consciousness and racial unconsciousness in order to more fully understand how race impacts their lives personally, locally, and immediately 100% of all the time. We'll engage with these questions. Just as we showed here, this equation and whatnot, to bring to the surface what degree of racial consciousness do they have and what degree of racial unconsciousness do they have. The second condition encourages us to isolate race while acknowledging the broader scope of diversity and the variety of factors that contribute to a racialized problem. Putting race on the table and keeping it there is a struggle because of the tendency to redefine institutional racial issues as internal factors that are more accessible and familiar to us, or perhaps as challenges that are external to school and district operations. For example, socioeconomic status or language fluency. The second condition assists educators in avoiding the tendency to divert attention from race. It guides participants to unpack race in order to better understand the pervasiveness of race and how it can influence all of our thinking schemas. Without unpacking race, white educators often attempt, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to make their colleagues of color as well as their students of color conform to the normalized conditions of white culture. This is an implementation exercise for isolating race. And to note, we're highlighting just a few implementation exercises. Each condition has multiple of those within the book. You would introduce the second condition of courageous conversations to whoever your participants are. And you'll ask your groups why it is important to isolate race in the conversation rather than avoiding it altogether or addressing it in conjunction with other diversity issues such as poverty and gender. You'll divide participants into small groups, mixing racial groups if possible. And each group will be assigned a section of the school system, their student body, the staff, community participation, extracurricular activities, etc. Prior to collecting and examining data regarding these sections, you will be asked what you believe to be the racial composition of the section you're investigating. And why did you believe this composition existed or persisted? Then you'll be presented with some concrete data of those sections, and you'll be asked to examine what is the racial composition of the subgroup you worked on. And then furthermore, what are the patterns you identified in your section in terms of the racial composition? And what preliminary explanations have you identified that explain these patterns? Some of these patterns may be due to unconscious bias or other factors. That's some of the things that this activity will bring to the surface. You'll continue furthermore with other prompts. And then at the next meeting, this is a two-part activity. You will report out your findings to the staff. There will be an open discussion to discuss factors such as what racial beliefs are operational in our school or school system, and how did the data we collected confirm or refute our racial beliefs? In our school or school system, do we have a problem with racial inequality in terms of representation, participation, and or achievement? And do we need to address these racial issues? If so, why and how? This is the first of many implementation exercises that'll help you keep and isolate race at the table of discussion. The third condition prompts us to normalize social construction of knowledge, thus engaging multiple racial points of view in order to surface critical perspective. To normalize social construction of knowledge is to acknowledge the process through which racial meaning is inherited, interpreted, and passed on from one generation to the next. The third condition enables educators to develop the will, the skill, and the capacity for listening to and engaging with others' contrasting and conflicting racial perspectives and experiences. Educators must formally recognize and respect that people offer a broad continuum of willingness and ability to examine and understand racial matters. Where and how people have grown up creates the lens through which they see the world racially. This is known as the social construction of knowledge. If everyone involved in a courageous conversation brings somewhat of a unique social construction of racial knowledge, then there will necessarily be multiple racial points of view to consider. The third condition of courageous conversation invites participants to normalize these social constructions and multiple racial points of view to surface contrasting, conflicting, or critical perspectives. Tremendous complexities exist around race as a socially and politically constructed phenomenon because race both exists and does not exist in the United States specifically, and more generally throughout the Western world. How, where, and with whom we live, work, and play forms out personal and collective racial context and is at the heart of how we interpret race in our lives and define race in the lives of others. Racial issues are not about physical skin color, but rather stem from the meaning and value people assign to skin color. The third condition hopes to indicate how much historical perspective about race is passed down from one generation to the next, thus shaping the way people view contemporary racial images in their interracial interactions. The third condition suggests that it is normal for different racial groups to offer different racial points of view as determined and defined by their shared racial experiences. By making normal or normalizing the presence of multiple racial points of view, we avoid a situation in which one way of understanding race, typically a dominant one, invalidates other points of view and thus invalidates other racial expressions and experiences as well. Counter narratives are critical perspective that reveal and explain the impact of racism. Only through surfacing and understanding of how racism is experienced by those most keenly aware and conscious of it, can educators arrive at a critical racial perspective about student engagement and the actual impact on and effectiveness of their teaching for underserved students of color and Indigenous students. The third condition is designed to support each of us in giving voice to our own racial experience, however we may interpret that experience to have occurred. The third condition merely encourages educators to embrace and entertain diverging points of view as a way of engaging with race in a deeply critical way. Rather than bringing conversation to a silent halt, these conflicting viewpoints serve as the doorway to sustained dialogue and as an opportunity to surface critical perspective about race, racial identity, and institutional racism. Here's an implementation exercise to conduct your participants through the third condition. You always will begin by first explaining and exploring that condition. You will then ask the group and participants to define the following terms: normalize, social construction of knowledge, multiple racial points of view, and critical perspective. You'll ask the group how the application of this condition can create a safe environment for people to share their honest opinions and feelings about race and racism. You'll conduct a listening exercise and divide participants into groups according to their race, known as a racial affinity group, and have them read the poem "I Dream" by Pablo Vega, which is on the worksheet you would hand out. You'll invite each educator to provide an individual response to the following question: what is Pablo saying about the impact of race on his life, both inside and outside of school? After each member shares, we'll create a unified interpretation of the poem that highlights the shared meaning and understanding arrived at by all or most of the group members. Each affinity group presents its interpretation of the poem to the greater group. You'll then invite participants to examine each racial affinity group's interpretation, summarizing the multiple racial viewpoints and surfacing critical racial perspective, and revealing ideas of which most people in the room were not aware. What were the similarities and differences among racial viewpoints? What social constructions were apparent in each group's interpretation? What value to the group's understanding came from hearing multiple racial points of view? And how can they be more fully honored in all of our conversations? The fourth condition keeps us all at the table. A culture of silence surrounding race serves only to perpetuate racism and to exacerbate racial achievement disparities that exist among students. The fourth condition of courageous conversation specifically focuses participants on the dialogue process as a way of ensuring greater safety and sustained deeper introspection. The fourth condition provides an opportunity to examine intentionally and consciously who is engaging, how they are engaging, and from where on the courageous conversation compass they are entering and moving about in the dialogue. The fourth condition asks participants to monitor the parameters of the conversation by being explicit and intentional about the number of participants, prompts for discussion, time for allotted for listening, speaking, and reflecting. You will use the courageous conversation compass to gauge where you and other participants are in terms of your emotional, intellectual, moral, and relational proximity and connection to a given racial topic. Another reason why the interracial conversation is so difficult is that people enter it having very different communication styles and desired outcomes. The fourth condition urges participants to talk less, listen carefully, and reflect more on what is being said. It's important to acknowledge that racial discourse in the US is governed by the cultural parameters of the dominant white population. And as a result, patterns have emerged in the ways of how communication may vary between white people and people of color. Singleton describes this as white talk versus color commentary. Identifying and remaining conscious about how we differently communicate and exercise control in conversations based on racial identity is critical to interracial understanding and progress. Balancing power and communication will empower communication. The courageous conversation compass will help participants continue to center themselves in these interracial dialogues so that these conversations can produce deeper introspection and deeper understanding. There are a number of implementation exercises for the fourth condition. We are choosing to show the one involving the courageous conversation compass, since it is an essential guide to navigating interracial dialogue. We will highlight that in this fourth condition. So before you introduce the compass, you'll pass out an accompanying worksheet that's available in the book to each member of the group. You're going to have participants describe in writing his or her basic opinion in the following areas: affirmative action, race riots, immigration laws, and welfare. You'll present the concept of the courageous conversation compass to the group. Participants will identify where on the compass their 4 opinions from step 2 are located. Emotion isn't emotional, is it the intellectual, the moral, etc. You'll have them write on the compass on the worksheet and where each of their opinions is located. Participants are then instructed to mingle with one another and listen to at least 3 others whose opinions on these subjects are located at different points on the compass. For example, someone who has an intellectual opinion concerning affirmative action should talk to 3 others who have relational, emotional, and moral opinions on affirmative action. There should be no discussion or debate after hearing one another's opinion. This is a listening exercise. You'll then bring the group back together and reflect on the experience. Could you find these people find people whose opinions were positioned differently on the compass? Was it difficult just to listen to the multiple perspectives without commenting? You'll have each person personally reflect on the differing opinions for each of the 4 subjects and keep this exercise in his or her courageous conversation journal. The 5th condition of the courageous conversation guides participants to establish agreement around a contemporary working definition of race that clearly differentiates it from ethnicity and nationality. The 3 C's of identity are corner, which designates citizenship either by birth or nationalization; culture, which describes how we live on a daily basis in terms of our language, ancestry, religion, food, dress, musical taste, traditions, values, political and social affiliations, etc. Color denotes color characteristics, or race, the meaning affixed to the noticeable melanin content seen in the skin, hair, and eyes. This is an implementation exercise we are highlighting for the 5th condition. You'll present the purpose of the condition, introduce and differentiate the 3 C's of identity. You'll have each participant define and identify their own personal corner, culture, and color. And then in small interracial groups, they'll share out their 3 C's. After discussion, you'll have each participant create his or her own working definition of race. In groups again, you'll address the following prompts. What is the identity with which you feel most comfortable? How does your corner differ from your culture? What connections exist between your culture and color identities? Of the 3 identities, which do you believe others see in you? And do you feel comfortable explaining your definition of race? The 6th condition is where you talk about whiteness. Conversations about race often prove difficult, and shining light on white as a color, culture, and consciousness is the most challenging aspect of these interactions. Not only does white define the dominant race, but also it represents the standard by which our racial awareness, experiences, and perspectives are judged. The dominant racial group collectively determines how each of us will be included and excluded in conversations. The 6th condition provides guidance as educators venture into the deepest and most essential dimension of and challenge to racial dialogue. Examine the presence and role of whiteness, its impact on the conversation, and the problem being addressed. Educators cannot truly understand the challenges faced by students of color and Indigenous students, challenges that result in lowered achievement, until we all develop a deeper understanding of what it means to be white. White is a color inherent with privilege and advantage. Understanding and defining white culture. When white people are unconscious of their privilege, their skin color benefits are viewed as entitlements. White culture characteristics regarding race: individualism, avoidance, and decontextualization. Individualism claims that I earned this, or making the effort equals reward perspective, a deeply embedded ideology within white culture. White people often fail to make the connection between themselves and the many other white people in any given situation who reinforce white cultural values and thus ensure maintenance of the systemic delivery of white privilege. Avoidance, this isn't my problem, represents the attitude of avoidance. Many white people have developed and embraced sophisticated ways to avoid thinking and conversing about their own positions of racial privilege and power. Decontextualization is evidenced in the oft-heard question, how does this particular situation have anything to do with race? Given that so many white people have trouble seeing themselves as part of a dominating racial group endowed with privilege and power, they also tend not to see how this context of whiteness has connections to events and outcomes at home and abroad. We're going to take a closer look at whiteness within the 5 conditions that we've previously just reviewed. The first condition, examine whiteness to establish a white racial context that is personal, local, and immediate. Second condition, isolate whiteness and determine how it impacts a given racial situation. The third condition, we need to normalize the social construction of whiteness to engage multiple white points of view and surface critical perspectives. Fourth condition, invites us to monitor the parameters of the conversation and to use the courageous conversation compass to determine how we are positioned intellectually, relationally, emotionally, and morally with respect to issues of whiteness. The fifth condition, we can better understand how white skin signals cultural correctness and national legitimacy. Finally, the sixth condition examines the presence and role of whiteness. It enables us to discover the context in which all racial matters are judged. This lays out what Singleton says as the various stages of white identity development. Contact is the first stage, where whites pay little attention to the significance of their racial identity. They perceive themselves as colorblind and completely free of prejudice. The second stage is disintegration, growing awareness of racism and white privilege as a result of personal encounters. This new awareness is characterized by discomfort. The third phase, reintegration, feelings of guilt or denial may be transformed into fear and anger directed toward people of color. Whites may be frustrated if seen as a group rather than as individuals. The fourth stage is pseudo-independent. The individual gains an intellectual understanding of racism as a system of advantage, but doesn't quite know what to do about it. Immersion, marked by a recognized need to find more positive self-definition. Whites need to seek new ways of thinking about whiteness, ways that take them beyond the role of victimizer. And the last stage, being autonomy, represents the culmination of the white racial development process. A person incorporates the newly defined view of whiteness as a part of personal identity. The process is marked by an increased effectiveness in multiracial settings. By acknowledging and understanding whiteness, white people begin to see the way in which their culture subordinates other cultures. With consciousness comes action, and with action comes transformation. This is an implementation activity for decentering whiteness. We begin by presenting the sixth condition of the courageous conversations. You'll ask participants to define whiteness according to the 3 C's, color, culture, and consciousness. You'll have groups work on defining, unpacking, applying, and decentering. Defining means to arrive at a common definition for the characteristic. Unpacking invites the group to explore how the concept plays out in each member's personal life. Applying is to find the connections between the characteristic of whiteness and schooling. Decentering is to identify ways in which group members challenge or replace the characteristics of whiteness with other contrasting ideals. Based on each group's level of readiness, have group members construct meanings of the terms listed below on their own, or ask them to refer back to the meanings presented in this chapter: universal perspective, individualism, avoidance, and decontextualization. They'll bring the groups back together and then debrief the experience.
Okay, so the big key to racial equity leadership is persistence. Don't give up. Continue the walk. Continue to go on. How racial equity leaders eliminate systemic racial disparities. Invisibility versus hyper invisibility. So when white privilege persists in schools without acknowledgement, and when whiteness in schools remain invisible, white educators may experience difficulty seeing how different life is for students of color and indigenous students whose race and racial cultures are hyper visible. Example, one Black student and a group of Black students invisible sea of white. And then versus a Black student's visible amidst visible whiteness and white students. So understanding the concepts of racial hypervisibility and racial invisibility in schools is crucial as we build a system of educators who persist in their racial equity leadership group. In this last one, you see the white students, that they're visible now. You see each individual. But if you were really talking in real schools, there would be all different student groups in that. So we kind of picked up on that would be a broader system of groups, a broader representation of groups. So how racial equity leaders eliminate systemic racial disparities, understanding systemic white racism. So here you see the table of institutionalized white racism, and it has 4 separate legs. White racism can be pictured as this tabletop supported by 4 legs: internalized white racism, interracial white racism, intra-racial white racism, and reverse white racism. Systemic racism can be viewed as the glue and nails that hold the entire table together, and those aspects that ultimately, yet often discreetly, assure its functionality. And then it's broken up, those groups are broken up further to give definitions of each. And we have internalized white racism, diminishment of all people who are not white. Interracial white racism occurs when different groups of colors are in conflict with one another over their positions relative to the dominant racial culture and their proximity to white racial power. Intra-racial white racism occurs among members within a particular group of color, varying levels of assimilation or resistance to whiteness, which threatens solidarity among collectively challenging white supremacy. And then the reverse white racism is characterized by strong feelings of discontent, mainly among white people. And last, we see institutionalized white racism. And that can be viewed as the policies, practices, and programs that initially or unintentionally, that intentionally or unintentionally perpetuate dominant white racial presence, positioning, and power.
Okay, so this is another implementation exercise. So the purpose of this is to actually lead a group to developing a shared vision of equity for your school. So first and foremost, we are going to present the quotation saying, solving the problem of racism in America's unfinished agenda, and it must be regarded by educators as a moral imperative. And in response to that quote, you're going to ask individuals to engage in conversations with the following question: to what degree are the equity efforts underway in the school system a demonstration of our moral imperative? So give them a time to respond to that. And then eventually, you're going to divide the participants into small groups of 4 or 5 people, handing them out the worksheet to each group. Then present the diagram for systemic racial equity transformation. Have the group develop an equity goal for each of the 3 domains. There's leadership, learning and teaching, and community. Then after that, regroup, list each of the goals they created for the 3 domains as a whole group, determine for each of the domains which goal will stand as the equity goal for the school or the school system. So after the meeting, prepare a polished copy of the agreed upon goals for which distribution, so that all stakeholders groups will benefit from these goals, can have access to them. So you will all share with that with the vision of equity for the whole school.
Courageous conversations as a strategy for achieving inequity in schools. Courageous conversations will equip your staff to be able to discuss race in a meaningful and impactful way. Furthermore, it will prepare your staff to be able to keep race at the center of all work and conversations, whether it be programming, community engagement, learning and teaching, or something else. We will only succeed in building more equitable schools when we join together as educators, parents, and community members, share our experiences, and build a consensus that all students have a right to schools free from institutional racism, receive the support they deserve based on their individual needs, equitable access to the resources needed for their education, a safe and healthy school climate for learning, and transparent decisions about their schools and education. To not be involved and engaged in racial equity work is to perpetuate systemic racism. There's no non-racist place. You're either leading for racial equity or perpetuating the racism that already exists. All potential racial equity leaders must find within themselves how racism is affecting them personally on a daily basis. They must then create their own personal and internal strategy that provides instruction on how to address their own individual racism. Having satisfied these prerequisites, they can engage with colleagues in discovering strategies to examine and eradicate inequities and racism in the classroom, school, district, and institutional levels. Finding passion for equity, developing equitable classroom practices, and being persistent in this work are the key components of and guiding strategy for racial equity leaders. When thinking about the strategy of courageous conversations, it almost seems like every single one of our frameworks is applicable at some time or other. It's a very complex topic. It's not a one-off, two-off meeting. This is ongoing. It's multiple years and even beyond. The one that really stuck out to me the most was managing complex change. I would say this is especially the case if you're going to engage in courageous conversations at a site where the norm has been to remain silent when talking about race, meaning people don't talk about it. This will be a very complex change to try and get people to engage in this type of discussion. So that's why I kind of leaned more towards managing complex change, having the foundation of a common vision. It's the moral imperative of racial equity work. If everyone's in agreement around that on a foundational level, you're going to be better positioned to start engaging in these kinds of conversations. But as a leader, it's important that we have the appropriate resources. We have everything mapped out in an action plan of how we're going to conduct these things, how we'll sustain these conversations over a long period of time, and how we ultimately then get into a place where we are doing racial equity work regarding the academics and performance of students. I also called to mind the ladder of inference, was specifically thinking about beliefs and conclusions and our actions, and how this strategy would probably really bring to the surface conflicting beliefs or conclusions that staff members may hold in differing actions. And it might lead people to hold common beliefs and come to common conclusions and adopt similar actions moving forward.
Yeah, for me, I believe that transformational leadership connects well with the courageous conversations about race, with the premise that there is no non-racist place wherever we are, at home, in school, any place in society, there's always going to be racism involved, in a way, to a certain degree. So as a leader, engaging your school into this courageous conversation about race provides an opportunity to change mindsets of people, which starts from the inside out, from the school to changing mindsets about race and racism in the community and society in general. So thereby transforming, mindsets of the entire society. Yeah, so transformational leadership,
So
engaging in courageous conversations about race will cause change in individuals and ultimately in our social systems.
okay, so I selected the 4 agreements, like Michael and Carmelita both said. All of these can apply in so many ways because it's such an in-depth conversation, and there's so much to it. But with the 4 agreements, it says be impeccable with your words, and it just reminds me that you can't be silent. It's uncomfortable, but you have to have the conversation, and you have to continue having the conversation. Don't take anything personally. You can't take anything personally. And especially as a white person listening to the conversation, it gets uncomfortable, but you can't take it personally if you want to grow in your knowledge and in your pursuit. Also, don't make assumptions, because we don't know somebody else's experience. And it's so easy to think that because you are sympathetic and understanding of somebody's plight and what they're going through, that you are at the level where they are. And until you experience it for yourselves, you can't really say, oh yes, I know what you mean. So it's good to not make assumptions on anything, and it's good not to assume we know what other people are feeling, but to listen to what other people are feeling. And then at the end of it, the 4 agreements is always do your best. To me, I would relate that to always do your best. So doing your best is to be completely aware, to stay focused on closing that racial achievement gap for your students in your classroom, and what can you do with this knowledge that you have to do your best to be the best teacher you can for all students, people who you can identify with and students who identify with you or don't identify with you. We still have to give our best and continually work to become better at our craft to reach all students and close that racial academic gap.